The storm came without warning, rolling across the countryside like a beast awakened from slumber. Thick, roiling clouds devoured the twilight, leaving behind an oppressive darkness that wrapped itself around Ethan Caldwell's modest home. The rain struck the tin roof in relentless bursts, drowning out the usual comforting hum of the house's old systems. Ethan was at his desk, half-heartedly tinkering with a dismantled servo unit, his hands moving on instinct while his mind wandered. It was supposed to be just another quiet evening, a retreat into his familiar world of circuits and solitude. But then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A thud. Faint, muffled, and irregular, it came from below. Ethan froze, his fingers tightening around the tiny screwdriver in his hand. The noise came again, a hollow percussion that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his own heartbeat. He turned his head toward the narrow door leading to the basement, a space he rarely entered these days. The wind howled outside, but it was the silence that followed the thud that unnerved him most. Ethan stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. A part of him wanted to dismiss the noise, a loose pipe perhaps, or something dislodged by the storm. But curiosity, tempered with unease, compelled him to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight from the counter, its weight oddly comforting in his hand, and moved toward the basement door. It groaned on its hinges as he opened it, revealing the narrow staircase plunging into shadows. The air that wafted up was damp and tinged with something unfamiliar, a faint metallic tang that didn't belong in his home. He descended slowly, each step creaking beneath his weight. The beam of his flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the scattered remnants of his former projects. Old machinery, forgotten tools, and dusty crates lined the walls, relics of a time when his work had been more ambitious. Now, they seemed almost like sentinels, standing watch in the dimness. The noise came again, louder this time. A sharp, distinct knock that sent a jolt through him. It was coming from the far corner, near the stack of disused panels he hadn't touched in years. Ethan hesitated, his breath shallow, the flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady but low, swallowed almost immediately by the basement's oppressive quiet. No answer. He edged closer, his movements cautious, every nerve in his body on edge. The beam of light swept across the floor, catching something unexpected, a faint smear of dark liquid leading toward the panels. Blood? He crouched instinctively, his mind racing. The liquid shimmered under the light, not quite the red he expected, but darker, with an iridescent sheen that made it seem almost alive. And then he saw it. A hand. Pale, slender, and inhuman. It jutted out from behind the panels, fingers splayed as if in silent plea or warning. Ethan's stomach twisted, a visceral reaction to the wrongness of the image before him. For a moment, he considered retreating, climbing the stairs two at a time, slamming the door shut, and pretending he'd seen nothing. But something held him there. He reached out and gripped the edge of the panel, its surface cold under his palm. With a sharp pull, he sent it crashing to the side, revealing the figure hidden behind it. She was slumped against the wall, her body partially obscured by shadows. Her skin, pale to the point of translucence, shimmered faintly under the flashlight's beam, as though it reflected more than just light. Her eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. She wore a tattered, unrecognizable garment, its fabric torn and stained with more of the strange, dark liquid. Ethan's mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. She wasn't human. That much was clear. The sharp angles of her face, the faint luminescence of her skin, and the slender, elongated fingers spoke of an otherworldly origin. And yet, she wasn't a stranger to pain. Her body bore signs of struggle, bruises blooming like dark flowers along her arms, a deep gash across her side still oozing the iridescent fluid. Her breathing hitched as she stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, Ethan's flashlight catching her eyes, a striking, unearthly shade of violet that seemed to pierce straight through him. Her gaze, though weak, held a mix of fear and defiance, as though she were prepared to fight despite her condition. "Don't." Her voice was barely audible, rasping and broken. "Don't call them." Ethan blinked, his mind reeling. "Them?" His mouth opened to ask, but she collapsed forward, her body going limp as unconsciousness overtook her. The flashlight fell from his hand, clattering to the floor and sending shadows dancing wildly across the walls. And in that moment, with the storm raging above and this alien woman bleeding out in his basement, Ethan Caldwell's world, his quiet, predictable world, began to crack open. Ethan Caldwell didn't sleep that night. The storm had subsided hours ago, leaving behind an eerie stillness that only deepened the unease curling in his chest. In the living room, the faint hum of his old heating unit was the only sound, but his thoughts were anything but quiet. He sat slumped in the worn armchair by the window, staring at the basement door as though it might spring open of its own accord. His hands were still stained, both with the oil he'd been working with earlier and the strange iridescent substance that now streaked across his palms. He'd tried washing it off twice, but the faint shimmer clung stubbornly, a quiet reminder of what lay below. Or rather, who. She hadn't stirred since collapsing. He'd carried her up from the damp, cluttered basement with an awkwardness that felt almost absurd, laying her on the couch with as much care as his trembling hands could muster. Up close, her alienness was even more pronounced. Her skin seemed thinner, more delicate than human skin, with faint traces of what looked like veins glowing softly beneath the surface. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her chest rising and falling with a rhythm that both reassured and unnerved him. Now, sitting across the room, Ethan wrestled with his next move. What do you do when an alien, an injured, possibly dying alien, appears in your basement? Call the authorities? Number that felt wrong. Dangerous, even. If the wrong people found out, what would they do to her? Dissect her? Lock her away in some lab? And who was she hiding from? Her plea echoed in his mind, fragile but insistent. Don't call them. Who the hell are they? He muttered aloud, his voice breaking the stillness. The words hung there for a moment, unanswered, before he shook his head and stood. His legs felt heavy, his movements slow, like he was wading through a nightmare that refused to end. He approached the couch cautiously, as though she might spring to life and attack him. But she remained motionless, her face slack, her alien features strangely serene. Ethan hesitated before kneeling beside her, his eyes scanning her injuries with the clinical detachment he relied on during his engineering work. The wound on her side was the worst of it. The fabric of her clothing had fused with her skin in places, and the fluid leaking from the gash shimmered faintly in the dim light. He wasn't a doctor. Hell, he wasn't even good at first aid, but leaving her like this didn't feel like an option. I'm going to regret this, he muttered, pushing himself to his feet. He rummaged through his supplies, gathering a first aid kit, a basin of water, and a handful of clean towels. The tools felt woefully inadequate for what he was about to attempt, but they were all he had. Kneeling beside her again, Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering just above her arm. She felt so fragile, as though the slightest pressure might shatter her. Taking a steadying breath, he set to work, his fingers moving with the same precision he used on delicate machinery. As he cleaned the wound, her body twitched involuntarily, her head turning slightly toward him. You're okay, he murmured, unsure if she could hear him. You're safe. For now. The phrase felt hollow. Safe. What did that even mean? He didn't know who or what was after her. He didn't know if they were watching him now, their alien tech scanning his every move. Paranoia prickled at the edges of his mind, but he forced it back. Hours passed in a blur of improvised care and quiet observation. The wound, once cleaned, looked less like a tear in flesh and more like damage to something synthetic. Beneath the surface, he glimpsed faintly glowing strands. Veins, perhaps, or some kind of bioengineered tissue. Whatever she wasn't just different. She was something extraordinary. When he finally finished, he slumped back against the armchair, exhaustion washing over him in waves. She seemed stable, at least for now, her breathing more even than before. But as the adrenaline ebbed, a new question clawed its way to the forefront of his mind. What happens when she wakes up? The answer came sooner than he expected. It started with a faint stirring, her fingers twitching against the fabric of the couch. Ethan, half dozing, snapped awake, his heart lurching as her violet eyes fluttered open. She blinked slowly, her gaze unfocused at first, then sharp as a blade. Her body tensed, her hand shooting out to grab his wrist with surprising strength. Where? Her voice was a rasp, weak but laced with urgency. Where am I? You're safe, Ethan said quickly, wincing as her grip tightened. My house. You were hurt. I patched you up. Her eyes narrowed, darting around the room before landing back on him. Did you call them? Ethan shook his head. No one knows you're here. I didn't tell anyone. Her body relaxed slightly, but her hand remained on his wrist, her expression unreadable. Why? The question caught him off guard. Why hadn't he called anyone? It would have been the rational thing to do, but as he looked into her eyes, alien yet deeply expressive, he realized he couldn't articulate the answer. I don't know, he admitted. You seemed scared, desperate. I guess I didn't want to make things worse. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, as though weighing his words, she released his wrist and sank back against the couch. My name, she began, her voice faltering. Zira. Ethan nodded, the name foreign yet oddly fitting. Ethan, he replied, unsure if she cared. Her eyes closed briefly, her breathing shallow but steady. When she spoke again, her words sent a chill through him. They'll come, she said, her tone matter of fact, tinged with resignation. They always do. Who? He pressed, leaning forward. Who's after you? Zira opened her eyes, and for the first time, Ethan saw fear in their depths, a fear so profound it made his own unease seem trivial. They're called hunters, she said quietly, and they won't stop until I'm dead. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a physical force. Whatever he'd stumbled into, it was bigger than he'd imagined. And it was only just beginning. The first hint of trouble came with a faint hum, so subtle that Ethan almost dismissed it as his imagination. But Zira's reaction was immediate. Her body stiffened, her eyes snapping open, their violet depths sharp and alert. She sat up too quickly, clutching her side with a wince, her gaze darting to the window. Did you hear that? She whispered, her voice tight. Ethan hesitated. Hear what? Her head tilted slightly, her expression darkening as the hum grew louder. It was an eerie, unnatural sound that seemed to vibrate in the very air, just on the edge of perception. Ethan felt it more than heard it, a faint pressure behind his ears that made him uneasy. They've found me, Zira murmured, her voice trembling with certainty. Ethan frowned, adrenaline spiking through him. Wait, what found you how? You've barely moved from that couch. Zira shot him a sharp look. The tracker. She ran a hand over her torso, grimacing. It must still be active. Tracker? Ethan stared at her, his mind struggling to keep pace. You're saying you've been walking around with a beacon this whole time? I didn't have a choice, she snapped. Removing it would have killed me without the proper tools. Before he could respond, a faint metallic clang echoed from outside, cutting through the tension like a blade. Zira's head whipped toward the sound, her expression hardening. They're here, she said grimly. Ethan's stomach dropped. The basement encounter had been unnerving, but this was something else entirely. He wasn't ready for this, whatever this was. I don't see anyone, he said, moving cautiously to the window. The night outside was quiet, the storm having left a film of mist clinging to the ground, but as he scanned the darkness, a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was a drone, sleek, silent, and predatory, hovering just above the tree line. Its matte black surface absorbed the moonlight, rendering it nearly invisible save for the faint red glow of its scanning lens. "Damn it," he muttered, stepping back. Zira was already on her feet, swaying slightly as she adjusted to the pain. "They'll have sent more," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "Drones first, then the hunters. We need to move." "Move where?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising. "They'll track you wherever we go. And in case you forgot, this is my house. What the hell am I supposed to do?" Her gaze softened, just barely. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said quietly. "But if you stay here, they'll kill you too." Ethan's mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had no idea who these hunters were or what they were capable of, but he didn't need much imagination to guess they weren't coming for a friendly chat. He took a steadying breath, forcing his thoughts into order. "Okay. You said the tracker's in you, right? Is there any way to disable it without, killing you?" Zira hesitated, her expression conflicted. "Maybe. If we had the right equipment." "What kind of equipment?" She rattled off a list of alien-sounding devices, most of which meant nothing to Ethan. But one word stood out. EM generator. His eyes lit up. "Wait, like an electromagnetic pulse?" Zira nodded. "A strong enough pulse could disable the tracker, temporarily at least." "I can do that," Ethan said, already moving toward his workbench. She blinked. "You can what?" "I can rig an EMP," he said over his shoulder, his hands flying across the cluttered surface as he gathered materials. "I've built them before, for testing equipment, not, intergalactic fugitives. But the principle's the same." Zira stared at him, a flicker of hope breaking through her guarded expression. "How long will it take?" "Not long," he replied, already sketching a crude circuit diagram on a scrap of paper. 10 minutes, maybe." "Make it 5, she said, moving toward the window. "They're getting closer." The hum outside grew louder as Ethan worked, every sound sharpening his focus. His hands moved with practiced precision, soldering wires and piecing together components as though his life depended on it, because, he realized grimly, it probably did. "Done," he said finally, holding up a rough but functional EMP device. Zira turned, her relief evident. "Will it work?" Ethan shrugged. "It'll fry every piece of electronics in a 50-foot radius, including your tracker." "Good enough," she said, motioning for him to follow. They moved quickly to the center of the house, where Zira crouched against the wall, her body tense. Ethan placed the EMP on the floor and stepped back, his finger hovering over the activation switch. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. The device emitted a sharp, high-pitched whine as it powered up, then released a burst of energy that rippled through the air. Lights flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. Outside, the drone's red lens blinked out, sending it spiraling into the trees with a crash. Zira exhaled shakily, placing a hand over her side. "It's off. I can't feel it anymore." Ethan's relief was short-lived. From the distance came a new sound, one that set his teeth on edge. Footsteps. "Looks like they're not just relying on tech," he muttered, his voice tight. Zira stood, her posture straight despite the pain. "Then we fight." "Fight?" Ethan stared at her. "With what? I'm an engineer, not some action hero." She glanced at his workbench, where a collection of tools and half-finished projects lay. "Then build something," she said simply. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint metallic clink of weapons being readied. Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. "I really hate today." Zira smirked faintly, her violet eyes glinting in the darkness. "Welcome to my world." As the first shadow appeared at the window, Ethan's hands moved once more, crafting solutions on the edge of desperation. Whatever was coming, it wasn't just Zira's fight anymore. It was theirs. The night felt heavier, thicker somehow, as though the weight of everything Ethan had stumbled into had seeped into the air itself. The EMP had bought them precious moments, but the silence that followed felt more foreboding than the hum of the drones ever had. It was the kind of quiet that came before the strike, before the world came crashing down. Zira was tense, her movements deliberate, but quick as she sifted through Ethan's scattered tools and devices. She pulled a coiled length of copper wiring from the pile, examining it with an intensity that belied the exhaustion still etched across her features. "You really think we're fighting our way out of this?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have a choice," Zira said flatly, tossing the wire aside. "They'll be inside within minutes, and they won't hesitate. You think your life doesn't matter to them just because you didn't mean to get involved?" She paused, her gaze locking onto his. "They'll kill you anyway. Loose ends don't survive the hunters." He wanted to argue, to say she was wrong, that there had to be another way, but deep down he knew she was right. Whatever these hunters were, whoever they worked for, they weren't here to talk. "What about you?" he asked. "You've clearly done this before. You've survived them." She hesitated, her hand brushing over her side where the now disabled tracker had been. "I survived," she admitted, "but not without help, and not without loss." The unspoken weight in her voice hit Ethan harder than he expected, and for a brief moment, the hard-edged warrior standing before him gave way to something more fragile. "Who helped you?" he asked cautiously, not sure if he was prying too far. Zira didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned back to the window, her silhouette outlined against the faint glow of the mist outside. "Mara," she said finally. "She's the reason I made it this far." "Is she—" Ethan let the question trail off, unsure how to finish it. "Alive?" Zira's tone was unreadable. "I don't know." She turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "The hunters don't leave much behind when they're done." Ethan swallowed hard, unsure what to say. The flicker of vulnerability in her voice felt like a thread he shouldn't pull, not when every second felt like a countdown to chaos. "They're here," she said suddenly, her body tensing. Ethan froze, his ears straining to pick up the sound. At first, he heard nothing. Then, faintly, the unmistakable creak of wood under pressure. The porch. The first impact came not at the door, but at the window. A sharp, deliberate strike that shattered the glass and sent shards cascading to the floor. Ethan barely had time to react before a dark figure dropped into the room, moving with a precision and grace that was anything but human. The hunter was tall and lean, its body encased in sleek obsidian armor that seemed to shift and ripple in the dim light. Its face, or what passed for one, was a blank reflective visor that gave no hint of the creature underneath. Zira moved first. In an instant, she was on the hunter, her movements a blur of speed and calculated force. Her fists struck with precision, targeting the weak points in its armor, but the hunter responded in kind, its fluid motions matching hers, blow for blow. Ethan stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the surreal sight before him. Then another crash shattered his paralysis. The door burst open, and two more hunters stepped inside, their weapons humming with lethal intent. "Damn it," Ethan hissed, his body finally catching up with his brain. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy wrench, and hurled it at the closest hunter. It connected with a loud clang, momentarily staggering the figure, but doing little real damage. "Stay back!" Zira shouted, her voice sharp as she ducked beneath a strike and drove her elbow into her opponent's torso. "You're no good to me dead." "Working on it," Ethan shouted back, diving behind the workbench as one of the new hunters turned toward him. His hands flew across the cluttered surface, searching for anything that could be turned into a weapon. He grabbed a small, half-finished device, an arc welder he'd been tinkering with, and yanked the wires free. The hunter advanced, its weapon raised, but Ethan didn't wait. He thrust the makeshift welder forward, pressing the activation switch. A burst of electricity arced from the device, striking the hunter square in the chest, The creature spasmed, its body locking up as the electrical surge coursed through it. Ethan didn't wait to see if it would recover. He grabbed the nearest chair and swung it with all his strength, sending the hunter crashing to the ground. "Ethan!" Zira's voice cut through the chaos. He turned to see her grappling with two hunters at once, her movements growing slower, more labored. Despite her skill, it was clear she was reaching her limit. "Hold on!" he shouted, grabbing another tool, a metal pipe this time, and rushing toward her. Together, they fought back the advancing hunters, their movements an uneasy synchronization of desperation and determination. Ethan wasn't a fighter, and his strikes were clumsy compared to Zira's precise blows, but he managed to hold his own, if only barely. The tide turned when Zira landed a devastating strike against one hunter, sending it crashing into the wall with enough force to crack its visor. She turned to Ethan, her breath ragged, but her eyes blazing. "Go to the basement," she ordered. "What? Why?" "Just do it." Something in her voice left no room for argument. Ethan nodded and bolted toward the basement door, his heart pounding as he descended the stairs two at a time. When he reached the bottom, he stopped short, his eyes widening in disbelief. There, hidden beneath a tarp in the far corner, was something he hadn't seen before. It was a device, sleek, alien, and unmistakably out of place among the clutter of his tools and machinery. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, moving closer. The device pulsed faintly, its surface etched with symbols he couldn't begin to decipher. It felt alive, almost as though it were waiting for something, or someone. "Ethan!" Zira's voice came from above, sharp and urgent. "Activate it!" "What does it do?" he shouted back. "It's our only chance." Ethan hesitated for only a second before reaching out. His fingers brushed against the device, and it came alive, the pulsing light intensifying as it emitted a low, resonant hum. From above came a sudden, blinding flash of light, followed by silence. Ethan's heart raced as he climbed back up the stairs, his mind spinning with questions. When he reached the top, he froze. The hunters were gone. Zira stood in the center of the room, her body tense, her expression unreadable as she stared at the now empty space where their enemies had been. "What just happened?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zira turned to him, her gaze heavy with something he couldn't quite place. "You activated a beacon," she said quietly, "and now they know where we are." Ethan's stomach dropped. "Who knows?" "The Resistance," she replied, her voice steady but grim. "But so does Voss." The air in the clearing was still, heavy with anticipation. Shadows danced across the uneven ground as faint beams of moonlight broke through the canopy of trees. The beacon hummed faintly in Ethan's bag, its alien energy coursing through the circuits he could barely comprehend. Ethan tightened his grip on the makeshift weapon in his hand, a length of reinforced piping, outfitted with a sparking electrical coil at its tip. Around them, the world seemed to hold its breath. Zira stood beside him, her frame taut with a warrior's focus. Her violet eyes flickered toward him, unreadable but steady. "They'll be here soon," she said quietly. "I figured," Ethan replied, swallowing the lump in his throat. "What's the plan?" Zira hesitated. It was subtle, but enough for Ethan to notice. "We hold our ground," she said finally. "The Resistance will come, but not before Voss's forces do. We have to buy them time." Ethan's mind reeled. The name Voss carried a weight he didn't yet fully understand, but the dread in Zira's voice was enough to make it real. "And what happens if we don't hold?" he asked. She looked at him, her expression softening just slightly. "We will." The first sign of their arrival came as a distant ripple in the air, a low hum that felt more like a vibration in Ethan's chest than a sound. Zira turned toward the noise, her stance shifting imperceptibly, like a predator sensing its prey. "They're here," she murmured. Ethan followed her gaze. From the tree line, figures emerged, silent and deliberate. The hunters moved with an eerie synchronicity, their sleek black armor catching faint glints of light as they spread out in formation. Behind them came a figure unlike the others. Voss. Even without Zira's whispered confirmation, Ethan knew it was him. The tyrant's presence was oppressive, his towering form clad in a crystalline armor that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. His face was hidden behind a translucent mask, his eyes cold and calculating. "Zira of Valara," Voss called, his voice deep and resonant. "How far you've fallen." Zira stepped forward, her shoulders square, her chin lifted defiantly. "I've fallen, yes," she said, her voice steady, "but I'm still standing. You should worry about that." Voss chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Bravado suits you, though it won't save you. Surrender now, and I may consider mercy. For your people, if not for you." Ethan glanced at Zira, expecting anger, but instead found her smiling, a small, dangerous curve of her lips. "You never understood my people," she said softly, "and that's why you'll lose." Voss raised a hand, signaling his hunters forward. "We'll see." The first clash was brutal. Zira moved with a grace Ethan could only describe as otherworldly, her strikes precise and devastating. She wielded a short blade she'd salvaged earlier, its edges glowing faintly with alien energy. Every movement was purposeful, her training and experience evident in the way she danced through the chaos. Ethan, by contrast, fought with desperation and raw determination. His improvised weapons sparked with each swing, discharging jolts of electricity that staggered the hunters when they got too close. He wasn't a warrior, but necessity made him quick, resourceful, and relentless. The hunters, however, were relentless too. For every one they brought down, two more seemed to take its place. "They're not stopping," Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse. "They don't need to," Zira replied, panting. "They only have to outlast us." Ethan's heart sank. He could see the strain in her movements now, the exhaustion creeping in despite her best efforts. "Then what's the point?" he asked, his frustration boiling over. Zira turned to him, her expression fierce. "The point is to prove them wrong." The tide shifted when the beacon activated. Ethan had almost forgotten about it in the chaos, but its sudden pulse of light drew everyone's attention. The hunters hesitated, their movements faltering as the beacon's hum grew louder. "What's happening?" Ethan asked, shielding his eyes. Zira's gaze remained fixed on the beacon. "The resistance is coming." True to her word, a moment later, the sky above them lit up with streaks of fiery light. Ships, sleek and angular, bearing the unmistakable markings of Valara's resistance, descended into the clearing, their weapons blazing. The hunters turned their focus to the new threat, their formation breaking as chaos erupted. Voss, however, remained still, his gaze locked on Zira. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Zira stepped toward him, her blade raised. "It ends here." The battle between Zira and Voss was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. They moved with a speed and precision that defied belief, their strikes sending shockwaves through the air. Voss's crystalline armor glowed with an unnatural energy, absorbing and redirecting Zira's attacks with devastating force. But Zira didn't falter. She fought with a ferocity born of years of pain, loss, and determination. Each strike carried the weight of her people's suffering, her movements driven by a singular purpose, to end Voss's reign. Ethan watched, helpless but captivated, as the two warriors clashed. He wanted to help, but this fight was beyond him. Finally, with a desperate, calculated strike, Zira found her opening. Her blade pierced the crystalline armor, striking true. Voss staggered, his hand clutching at the wound as his mask cracked, revealing a face twisted with rage and disbelief. "You've lost," he gasped, his voice fading. Zira stepped back, her blade slick with his blood. "No," she said softly. "You did." With a final gasp, Voss collapsed, his body crumpling like a broken statue. The aftermath was a blur. The resistance forces secured the area, rounding up the remaining hunters and tending to the wounded. Zira, though battered and bruised, stood tall amidst the chaos, her presence commanding. Ethan approached her cautiously, unsure of what to say. "It's over," he said finally. Zira turned to him, her expression softening. "For now." "What happens next?" he asked. She looked to the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were breaking through the trees. "I go home," she said simply. "There's still so much to rebuild." Ethan hesitated. "And me?" Her gaze returned to him, a small smile playing on her lips. "That's your choice." He thought about his quiet life, the one he'd left behind when Zira stumbled into it. And then he thought about everything he'd seen, everything he'd done since. "I think," he said slowly, "I'm ready for something new." Zira nodded, as though she'd expected nothing less. "Then let's go," she said. As the Resistance ships rose into the sky, carrying them toward an uncertain but hopeful future, Ethan couldn't help but smile. For the first time in years, he felt alive. The wind on Hadrian IV was not like the soft breezes of Valessa's homeworld, Anvara. Here it howled, dry and unrelenting, scraping against the skin like a predator testing the defenses of its prey. Valessa stood at the edge of the shuttle's ramp, her silken diplomatic robes fluttering violently, struggling against the hostility of this barren world. Her large, luminous eyes, the color of dusk on Anvara, scanned the horizon, a jagged expanse of ochre dust and steel-gray clouds, broken only by the towering silhouettes of the human military base. Her first impression was not brutality, as she had been warned, but something far more unnerving: efficiency. Behind her, the Anvaran escorts murmured in their resonant musical tones. "This is a mistake," one of them whispered, their words faint but clear over the wind. Valessa ignored them, stepping forward with a resolve she didn't quite feel. The airlock of the base hissed open, releasing a gust of pressurized air tinged with the faint tang of metal and oil. A figure emerged, tall and imposing, clad in the angular utilitarian uniform of the human military. Captain Adrian Wolf's gaze met Valessa's, his dark eyes unreadable. He was everything she had expected of a human soldier, broad-shouldered, sharp-jawed, and radiating an aura of control honed by countless battles. But his expression lacked hostility. It was calm, measured, and unsettlingly direct. "Valessa of the Anvaran," he said, his voice crisp, cutting through the wind like a blade. "Welcome to Hadrian IV. I trust your journey was uneventful." Valessa hesitated for only a fraction of a second before offering the serene smile she had practiced for such occasions. "Uneventful," she replied, her tone melodic, almost too composed. She descended the ramp, the weight of her robes dragging against the dry air, making each step deliberate. The Zanor delegates emerged behind her, their movement sharp and predatory. Their leader, Sarek, was a gaunt figure with a sly, permanent sneer. His species' resemblance to skeletal predators unnerved even the most seasoned diplomats. Sarek's gaze flicked to Wolf, then back to Valessa, his lips curling. "They send their finest warriors to play hosts," Sarek remarked in his gravelly tone, loud enough for all to hear. Wolf didn't react, his expression a mask of neutrality. Valessa noted the subtle tightening of his jaw, a detail she would have missed if not for her trained eye. "Follow me," Wolf said, turning sharply and striding toward the base. Inside, the transition was stark. The harsh desolation of the planet gave way to a world of sterile corridors, harsh lights, and a low hum of machinery. Soldiers moved with purpose, their boots echoing against metal floors. Valessa's sensitive ears caught snippets of conversations, jargon heavy and alien to her, yet brimming with urgency. "Captain Wolf," Valessa began as they entered an elevator that groaned under the weight of the group. "I understand this facility is known for its unique training methods. I look forward to observing them." Wolf glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Unique is one way to describe it," he said. "Another might be necessary." The elevator doors slid open, revealing an expansive observation deck with a panoramic view of the training grounds below. Valessa stepped forward, her gaze drawn to the sight. Rows upon rows of soldiers moved with mechanical precision, their movements synchronized like the gears of a massive machine. But it wasn't just their coordination that struck her. It was the intensity. Every motion, every step, every shout carried an edge of desperation, as though their lives depended on getting it right. "What you see here," Wolf said, stepping beside her, "is only the surface. You'll understand more as you observe." Valessa's reply was interrupted by Sarek's derisive snort. "Impressive theater," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But let's not forget, no amount of drills will change what humans are: short-lived, fragile, and impulsive." This time, Wolf turned to Sarek, his gaze steady, unblinking. "Fragile, perhaps. Impulsive sometimes. But you'll find we're full of surprises, Sarek." The tension in the room thickened, but Valessa found herself more focused on the scene below. Something about the way the soldiers moved, their sheer tenacity, stirred a strange unease within her. These were not warriors bred for war, like the Xenor, nor scholars of peace, like the Anvaran. They were something else entirely, something she couldn't yet define. As the drills continued, an alarm suddenly blared, sharp and jarring. Wolf's posture stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to the communicator on his wrist. "What's happening?" Valessa asked, her voice calm but edged with curiosity. "Unexpected simulation," Wolf said, his voice tight. He turned to a nearby officer, exchanging quick, hushed words. Valessa's eyes narrowed. She had studied humans extensively before her arrival, but nothing in her studies had prepared her for this moment. The raw intensity of their response, the seamless transition from routine to readiness. The soldiers below were no longer merely training. They were preparing for something real. And for the first time since her arrival, Valessa felt a flicker of something alien to her, a thrill of apprehension. What exactly had she stepped into? The training yard below seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. The human soldiers moved with precision, each step an echo of the military machine they had been honed to become. But something in the air felt wrong. Valessa could sense it. It was as if the ground beneath them was slowly shifting, not in the literal sense, but in a way that seemed to stretch the fabric of time itself. She had been in many war zones across the galaxy, though never as a participant, always an observer. But here, on this desolate planet, surrounded by soldiers whose lives were shaped by the constant threat of conflict, Valessa felt the weight of a different kind of tension, one that was heavier than mere strategy. It was something primal, a quiet force gathering in the background, just out of sight. Wolf stood beside her, his arms folded across his chest, his face a mask of unreadable professionalism. He had said little since the alarm had blared, his attention focused on the soldiers below, who were now scrambling into position, preparing for what seemed to be a new, unscheduled drill. His expression remained impassive, though the slight tension in his jawline betrayed an edge beneath the calm. Valessa's eyes darted to the Xanor delegates. They too had shifted, their postures subtly alert, though they maintained their usual arrogance. Sarek was muttering something in his native tongue, his gaze never leaving the soldiers. Valessa was sure he wasn't impressed by the spectacle unfolding before them, but she also knew that the Xenor had a habit of hiding their true thoughts behind a veil of disdain. "What's happening?" she asked again, her voice calm, though the question burned at the edges of her composure. She had to understand. She had to know why the atmosphere had shifted so suddenly. Wolf glanced at her, his eyes momentarily softening, though only for a second. "It's a simulation," he said quietly, as though the words themselves could explain everything. "A test of adaptability, real-world conditions, nothing to worry about." Valessa didn't believe him. The soldiers below had been moving with a sense of purpose, yes, but now they were moving differently, more urgently. The controlled chaos of their training had morphed into something else, something far darker. There was a deeper tension in the air now, a pressure building like the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The soldiers were no longer following orders. They were anticipating something. A moment later, a series of sharp bursts echoed across the yard. A few soldiers broke formation, diving to the ground. But this time it wasn't a drill. The air seemed to hum with the unmistakable vibration of incoming fire, the ground shaking with the impact of something much heavier than anything simulated. Valessa froze. This was real. She had never experienced anything like this before, this sudden shift from practice to actual danger. Her instincts screamed at her to retreat, to seek shelter. But she couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene unfolding below. Wolf's voice was clipped. "All units to emergency positions," he barked into his communicator. The words barely left his lips before soldiers began to scatter, weaving in and out of cover, their movements fluid but panicked. This wasn't a game. It was a test. But for what? It was clear now that the human soldiers weren't simply reacting. They were surviving. Each action, each decision, was driven by a fundamental need to stay alive, to protect one another. Valessa felt a shiver run down her spine. It wasn't the precision of their training that made them dangerous. It was the ferocity with which they fought for survival. She glanced back at Wolf, who had turned away from her, his attention fixed on the chaos below. He was issuing orders, his voice sharp and commanding, every word measured and purposeful. He didn't seem to question whether this was part of the drill anymore. There was no time for that. For the first time since her arrival, Valessa saw the cracks in the human facade. She had known they were capable of violence, of war. But now, in the midst of this unexpected attack, she realized that their strength lay not in their ability to kill, but in their relentless determination to protect and preserve, no matter the cost. But there was more to it, she sensed. Something wasn't right. She didn't know whether the soldiers below were fully aware of the danger. She didn't know if they understood the extent of what had just been unleashed. But as she watched them spring into action, fighting as if their lives depended on it, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else, something beneath the surface. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden explosion that rocked the yard. Soldiers scattered, but one of them, young Lieutenant Morgan Reyes, was knocked to the ground. The shockwave sent her sprawling, but within seconds, Morgan was back on her feet, wiping dirt from her face as though the explosion had been nothing more than an inconvenience. Valessa's breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary soldier. Morgan Reyes had a look in her eyes, a fire, a determination to survive that went beyond mere duty. Valessa's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, trying to comprehend the depths of what she was witnessing. Was this the true power of humanity, the ability to rise from the ashes, to adapt and endure, even when the world seemed determined to destroy them? "Captain," a voice snapped, breaking her focus. Wolf was already on the move, striding toward the edge of the observation deck. He didn't need to look back to know Valessa was there. She had been silent, watching, processing. "Stay here," he commanded. His voice was colder now, filled with an urgency that hadn't been there before. "Where are you going?" Valessa asked, her voice steady but laced with tension. Wolf didn't answer, but his eyes flashed to hers for just a moment. "I'll be back. Stay out of the way." Before she could respond, he was gone, swallowed by the chaos below. Valessa stared after him, a deep unease creeping up her spine. She could hear the sounds of combat, the heavy thuds of footsteps, the sharp crack of weapons discharging, the frantic commands echoing across the yard. But there was another sound, something beneath it all, a low, almost imperceptible hum, like the thrum of a storm just on the horizon, waiting to break. Something was coming, something they weren't prepared for, and Valessa was caught in the middle of it. The Xanor delegates were already moving, whispering among themselves, their eyes narrowing in suspicion. Valessa could see the familiar flicker of calculation in their expressions. They were plotting something, but she couldn't tell what. And in that moment, Valessa knew. This was no longer just about observing humanity. She was part of something far greater now. The mysteries were beginning to unravel, but they were leading her down a path with no clear way back. What was coming next, and what part would she play in it? The answers were out there, hidden in the chaos, and Valessa was no longer sure if she was ready to find them. The ground trembled beneath Valessa's feet, as the sounds of battle intensified below. Her gaze darted from soldier to soldier, each moving with a controlled urgency that made her pulse quicken. The air was thick with the acrid scent of dust and the sharp tang of sweat, and in that moment, the carefully constructed barrier between observer and participant began to crumble. She wasn't just watching anymore. She was in it. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. She could feel the tension in her limbs, the tightening in her stomach as her mind raced to process the chaos unfolding before her. Adrenaline. It was the first real sensation she'd had since arriving on this planet, real, raw, and full of life. In her world, she had never known a day of war, nor had she ever seen someone fight for their life with such an unyielding hunger. The Anvaran had lived by their intellect, their wisdom, their peaceful negotiations. What was it that made the humans so different? Was it their willingness to fight, to sacrifice? Was it their absolute refusal to bow under pressure? Her eyes lingered on Lieutenant Morgan Reyes as she sprinted across the yard, her face a mask of determination. The explosion had knocked her down, but the young woman hadn't hesitated. She had risen immediately, as though the fall was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Now she moved with fluid grace, her every motion a testament to her training and to her resilience. Valessa wanted to understand. She needed to understand. But how? A distant roar reverberated through the yard, cutting through her thoughts. It was a sound that carried a weight beyond the noise, a warning perhaps, or something darker, something that didn't belong. Her heart skipped a beat. That wasn't part of the simulation. Her instincts screamed at her to turn away, to retreat to the safety of the observation tower, but something rooted her to the spot. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be a quiet, impartial observer, no more, no less. But as the soldiers below fought with everything they had, she couldn't deny the pull she felt to be a part of this, to understand why it was happening, to understand them. And then she saw it, a figure moving in the shadows, barely visible against the backdrop of chaos. It was too fast to be a soldier. It moved with an eerie precision, its shape flickering in and out of her peripheral vision like a phantom. The hum in the air grew louder, and her pulse quickened in sync with the mysterious figure's movements. She wasn't imagining it. The figure was real. "Captain!" she called, her voice a sharp cry that cut through the chaos. She needed answers. Now. Wolf, who had been barking orders at the soldiers below, turned sharply toward her voice. His expression hardened, his eyes narrowing, as he made his way up the stairs to where Valessa stood. "What is it?" His voice was low, controlled, but Valessa could see the tension in his posture, the way his gaze flickered across the yard. "There's someone down there," she said urgently, pointing toward the shadows. "It's not one of your soldiers. I saw something." Wolf's eyes followed her finger, but his face betrayed nothing. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone tight with something Valessa couldn't quite place. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of her own confusion. "But it's moving too quickly, too deliberately. It's—" She paused, biting back a growing sense of dread. "It's not human." Wolf's eyes hardened, a flicker of realization flashing across his face before he turned toward the stairwell. "Stay here. I'll go check it out." "Wait!" Valessa reached out instinctively, her hand grasping at the air, desperate for something, anything to keep him from going into the fray. "You don't understand. You don't know what it is." But he was already gone, disappearing into the frenzy below. Valessa stood frozen, her breath coming faster as the realization settled in. She had felt it before, back when she first encountered the humans in their training. The dangerous edge to them, the relentless drive to survive. But this was something else entirely. This was not human. She had only seen glimpses, but it was enough to make her blood run cold. A shape moved again, this time more clearly, darting between the soldiers with impossible speed, its form barely more than a blur. The soldiers didn't seem to notice, or maybe they did, and they were choosing not to acknowledge it. Valessa's heart hammered in her chest as her mind tried to piece together the puzzle. Was this another test? A new form of training designed to push the soldiers even further? Or was it someone, more insidious? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a loud explosion, closer this time, rattling the very walls of the observation tower. The ground beneath her feet buckled and she stumbled, almost losing her balance. Her breath hitched, but she steadied herself, gripping the rail beside her. Her eyes locked onto the chaotic scene below. This was no longer a drill. A heavy silence fell over the yard as the smoke cleared, and in its wake, the figure emerged fully from the haze. It was no longer a shadow, no longer a ghost. It was a person, or something that resembled one. Its skin was too pale, almost translucent, its eyes glowing with an unnatural hue. Its movements were unnervingly precise, as though every action was calculated, planned far in advance. It stood a few paces from the soldiers, unscathed by the explosions and gunfire that had just torn through the yard, and then it spoke. The voice was low, distorted, almost mechanical. This is only the beginning. Valessa's breath caught in her throat. Her mind reeled, trying to process the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just an anomaly. It was a message, a warning perhaps, or something more cryptic. She couldn't look away as the figure turned its head, locking eyes with her. The intensity of its gaze sent a jolt through her chest, and for the first time since she had arrived on this planet, Valessa felt an overwhelming sense of fear. She wasn't just observing a military exercise anymore. She was witnessing the first sign of something far darker, something that could unravel everything. "Captain!" she shouted, turning toward the stairs, but Wolf had already disappeared into the smoke, chasing after whatever threat had emerged. She was alone now, trapped in the storm of confusion and chaos. But she knew this much. Whatever it was, whatever this thing was, it was not just here to test the human soldiers. It was here for something much more dangerous, and Valessa was now a part of it. The sound of gunfire echoed in Valessa's ears, sharp and relentless, as she stood on the precipice of a decision that could change everything. The chaos below had escalated into an inferno of motion. Soldiers were scrambling, taking cover, firing their weapons, and calling orders with a frantic urgency that sent a tremor through the air. The figure, the one that had been cloaked in shadows, was no longer hiding. It was at the center of it all, its movements unnervingly graceful amidst the pandemonium. And amidst it, Valessa stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the figure. Her mind screamed at her to move, to help, to do something, but her body betrayed her, locked in place by the fear and the impossible weight of what she was witnessing. The thing, or whatever it was, had made its way into the heart of the training yard, moving with an unnatural precision. It wasn't a soldier, it wasn't human, it was something else entirely. Adrenaline spiked through Valessa's veins, and for the first time since arriving, she realized how deep the gulf between the Anvaren and the humans truly was. They lived without war, without violence, but here, in this moment, she could feel the pulse of danger, the palpable tension that lived and breathed in this world of combat. The stakes were real. The consequences could be deadly, and she had no idea where the line was drawn between the trained soldiers and the unknown force standing before them. "Where is Wolf?" she whispered under her breath, her voice barely audible over the chaos. She couldn't see the captain in the fray. The smoke had thickened, blurring everything in its wake, and the soldiers' shouts were growing increasingly desperate. Her heart pounded as she stepped back from the edge of the observation platform, eyes darting toward the stairs. "Captain," she called again, her voice rising in urgency. "Where are you?" A single shot rang out from the distance, followed by a scream that cut through the tension like a knife. Valessa flinched, her pulse quickening as the sounds of the confrontation became louder. She was no longer safe in her high perch. She couldn't remain distanced from the action anymore. She had to act. Before she could even fully process the implications of her thoughts, a figure broke through the haze of smoke, running toward her. Wolf. His face was smeared with blood, his uniform singed in places, but there was no time for questions. "We need to go," Now. His voice was hoarse, edged with panic as he grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the stairs. "Wolf, what's happening?" Valesa's voice cracked, fear threading through her words. Her pulse was erratic, her breath shallow. She hadn't seen the threat up close, but she had felt its presence, and now it was clear that it wasn't something that could be ignored. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he dragged her through the corridors of the observation tower, his steps heavy with urgency. "We've been compromised," he muttered, eyes scanning their surroundings as if expecting danger to strike at any moment. The simulation was just a cover. This isn't a training exercise, it never was. "What are you talking about?" Valesa's confusion deepened, her mind struggling to make sense of the storm of emotions. "I saw it. The figure. It's not human. What is it?" Wolf's jaw tightened as he glanced behind them, his grip on her arm firm but not unkind. "It's a saboteur," he said darkly, "but not in the way you think. It's something else entirely, and right now, it's targeting us." Valesa's stomach churned. Sabotage? This wasn't just a drill gone wrong. This was an attack. Before she could respond, a loud explosion rattled the building, the force shaking the walls with such ferocity that it felt as though the entire base had been lifted off its foundations. Valesa stumbled, but Wolf steadied her, his expression darkening as he scanned the corridor ahead. "Move. Now," he ordered, his voice cutting through the noise. "We don't have time." They ran. As they moved through the winding halls, the sense of urgency grew palpable. The walls seemed to close in around her as the sounds of chaos outside grew louder. Her mind raced with questions, but none of them had answers. The enemy was close, too close, and she had no idea what its endgame was. The thought hit her like a brick to the chest. What if this wasn't just about the soldiers? What if the real target was her? "We're not safe here." Wolf's words were grim as he led her toward a secure exit, the sound of distant shouting and gunfire still echoing through the base. "The saboteurs knew we'd be here. They planned this from the beginning." Valesa stopped dead in her tracks, a sudden bone-deep fear gripping her chest. "Planned? But why would they—" Wolf cut her off with a sharp look. "Because you're the key, Valesa, your people, the Anvaran." The revelation hit her like a wave crashing against jagged rocks. "What do you mean? I'm just an observer. I have no—" He silenced her with a glance. "It's not about you. It's about what you're observing." Before Valesa could digest this new information, there was a flash of movement ahead, swift, fluid, and unmistakably human. But it wasn't Wolf. It wasn't anyone from the base. The figure was wearing a dark suit, its features obscured by a helmet, but there was no mistaking the unmistakable aura of danger that radiated from them. "Wolf!" Valesa gasped, grabbing his arm in a panic. "Who is that? What is—" He didn't respond. Instead, he turned to her with cold eyes, his hand pushing her behind him in one swift motion. His voice was sharp. "Stay back." The figure didn't move forward immediately, but its presence was enough to send a chill up Valesa's spine. It was waiting, watching, and then, without warning, it spoke, its voice cold and devoid of emotion. "You're in the wrong place, Captain, and so is she." The words sent a ripple through Valesa's mind. She understood them now, not just as a warning but as a confession. This was no ordinary saboteur. This was someone, or something, that had been waiting for her, waiting for the Anvaran. And the truth was darker than anything she could have imagined. Wolf stepped forward, his face hardening, his stance unyielding. "Get out of the way. You're outnumbered." The figure only tilted its head, a mechanical laugh escaping its lips. "We shall see, Captain. We shall see." As the words lingered in the air, Valesa's heart sank. She wasn't just caught in the crossfire of a military exercise anymore. She was at the center of something far more dangerous, something that could change everything she knew about her people and her place in this galaxy. The mysteries she had come to solve were now her greatest threat, and it was only just beginning. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, charred metal and burning fuel as Valessa stood at the heart of the crumbling compound, her body stiff with exhaustion. The silence that followed the chaos of the battle was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the emergency generators and the distant crackle of flames consuming the remains of the base. Her thoughts were as fractured as the wreckage around her. But one thing was certain now. She had come to the end of this path, a path she never should have walked. Her fingers trembled as they brushed the ruins of a shattered console, its screen flickering weakly, casting pale light onto the faces of those who had fought and fallen. Behind her, Wolf stood guard, his back to her, his silhouette rigid as he scanned the perimeter. His eyes were still fierce, but there was something different now, a resigned weight to his presence. He had made his choice. The choices they had made together, in the thick of the fight, had cost them everything. Friends, allies, safety. The truth was now fully exposed, its implications heavier than any weapon could be. And Valessa had no way of undoing the damage. "You don't have to do this," Wolf said, his voice hoarse but steady. He spoke as though he were addressing the battlefield itself, rather than her. "We could still leave, together. You don't owe them anything." Valessa's gaze remained fixed on the flickering console. Her reflection stared back at her, fractured, distorted, a ghost in a machine. Her chest tightened, a pang of longing threatening to unravel her. She knew what he was offering. Escape. A chance to leave behind everything that had broken her. But she could feel it now. The weight of her responsibility. The irreversible decisions that had set her on this course. "I do owe them," she whispered, her voice cracking as she turned to face him. "I owe them the truth." Her eyes met his, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she saw the depth of the choice in them, the choices they had made. There was a war inside her, a clash between the woman she had been and the one she had become, the war between duty and desire, between survival and justice. "The Anvaran," she began, her words faltering. "The Anvaran never knew. Not really. We thought we were safe. We thought we were just observing, but it was never just that." Wolf stepped forward, his face softening, his hands reaching out to her. "Then let it go. All of it. We've done what we could." But the pull of the truth was stronger than any promise he could offer. It was the same truth that had haunted her since the day she'd first set foot on this cursed world, this war-ravaged, fractured place where secrets bled into one another, and everyone was complicit in a lie. "No," she said firmly, taking a step back. "I can't." The sound of footsteps, heavy and measured, approached from the doorway. Valessa's heart skipped a beat, but she did not flinch. This was the moment, the inevitable confrontation that had been building from the very first shot. "Valessa." The voice was familiar, but colder than she remembered. It belonged to General Harrow, the leader of the human forces who had overseen the operation. She hadn't seen him since the chaos began, but now he stood before her, his face marred by a grim expression. "I know what you've done." His words were simple, direct, but the weight behind them felt suffocating. "You're not leaving. None of you are." Wolf's stance stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to the weapon at his side, but Valessa reached out, stopping him. She had come too far to be intimidated, too far to be silenced. The truth was her weapon now. "No," Valessa said again, her voice unwavering. "You don't understand. This isn't just about us. It never was." General Harrow's brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What are you talking about?" The silence that followed was thick, pressing down on her as she gathered the last remnants of her courage. "The Anvaran didn't just observe. We were never meant to simply watch. We were part of a greater plan, one that was set in motion long before I ever entered this base. We've been manipulated, all of us, and now we're paying the price." Wolf's eyes darted between the two of them. He looked as though he were about to speak, but Valessa's gaze held him back. This was her truth, her burden to bear. "I was sent here to learn, General, but what I learned was that we've been kept in the dark. And we've done the dirty work for a much larger agenda, one that the humans, the Anvaran, the entire galaxy have been a part of. This isn't just about war, it's about control." Harrow's expression shifted. Anger, confusion, then something else, something darker. "Enough of this," he snapped, stepping forward. "You're out of your depth, Valessa. You have no idea what you're dealing with." But she didn't flinch. "You can't hide from it anymore, Harrow. Not from the truth, not from the consequences." For a moment, the silence between them hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Then, with an abrupt motion, Harrow reached for his comm device, his fingers trembling slightly as he spoke into it. "This is General Harrow. We have a problem." Valessa's heart skipped a beat. It was done. There was no turning back now. The hum of activity resumed in the distance as soldiers scrambled to secure their positions. The battle was far from over, but something had shifted, something irreversible. Valessa felt it deep within her bones. The ground had shifted beneath their feet, and now there was no escape from what had been set into motion. "This war won't end the way you think it will," she said, her voice low but her conviction clearer than ever. And then, as she turned to walk away, Wolf stepped up beside her. His presence was solid, unwavering. He didn't say a word, but his actions spoke volumes. He had made his choice. He would stand with her, whatever the cost. They left the ruins of the compound behind, stepping into the unknown, the weight of the truth still hanging heavy between them. There would be no easy answers, no clean escape from the mess they had created. But as they walked side by side, Valessa knew one thing for certain. The war was just beginning, and she was ready to fight for it, for them.